right through best bud. What? I know.
All right, I guess we can get started.
Why would you do a smart one instead of a TV?
So, as Mark said, my name is Brian. I'm a freelancer. I have just recently started going freelance, and I'll kind of explain more about that in a minute. But one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk is I have been in two different situations at two different companies, one where they listened to me and one where they didn't. And I have that mentality that I'm always right. You can ask Jake. So
He is, I haven't.
yeah, I am. At least I'm open about it. No, but coding standards and unit testing, I have for about 4 years now really been pushing those. And when I first started, I really didn't know much about them, but everything that I read about them and every use case and every documentation, everything looked like this was the way things should be because it makes things so much easier to work with as a group, work on a project as a group. So I'm going to explain, what they are, why to use them, when to use them, where you can get them and where you can use them, and a little bit of how to use them as well. Just so everyone knows, the speaker deck, the slides are up on speaker deck. It contains some links to tools and resources, so if you want to follow along or if you just simply want to look it up later, it's just that. I'll leave it up here for about a minute so that everyone that wants it can get it. All right, so about me, I've been writing with PHP for a little over 5 years now. I started out at FiberNet in Orem. I was writing PHP kind of per hour for their clients, and when you first start writing code, it always looks horrible, so I always cringe looking back on it. But I'm really glad that I got my start there. I ended up going to SUU for a little over a year, and it just so happened that when I moved down there, I happened to run into the head of the tech department who just happened to be letting go their student programmer because he was graduating that year. So after talking with him, I pretty much cinched the job as the one and only student programmer, which was really an excuse to give a student maybe 5 hours worth of work a week, but let them bill up to 20 to kind of gain experience. So I spent probably about 15 hours a week just in a lab by myself, full access to resources from the university, learning PHP. I've been using Linux for over a decade, Fedora mostly, but I've tried Ubuntu, Elementary OS, Arch. I tried BSD for a little while. I've tried them all. They're a lot of fun, a lot of different ones. I keep coming back to Fedora because it's the one that I started on. And I actually had the story of how I got started on Linux published on opensource.com, I think it was. So the full story's there, but long story short, my brother-in-law, who was raised in a house where they had OS2 and early Unix stuff, he came over to my house while I was at work and completely wiped Windows off my computer, installed Fedora Core 4, installed a few of the programs I was used to, took my Windows CD and left, and said have fun. And so I couldn't reinstall Windows, and I was forced to use it for over a month, and I actually ended up really, really liking it. So, but like I said, if you want to go look it up on open source, it's up there. And like I said, I've been advocating for PSR and unit testing because of mainly the two experiences that I've had. We'll start off with PSR, and as Mark said, these are recommendations. Very much as the Pirates of the Caribbean says, they're more of guidelines than anything. So the nice thing about that is there are some defaults that you can use that a lot of people use, and they're pretty good, but if there's something about them you don't like, you can either leave it out or change it out for something else. There are different levels. That a level really only refers to a numerical ID that talks about what the standard is. So quickly, you have level 1, which is just a basic coding standard, which says you won't have a byte order mark at the beginning of your files. You will always use the long opening tags instead of short opening tags, and a few other things to that effect. Level 2 goes in deeper, says that you'll use spaces over tabs. That's the default, but if you don't like that, you can actually change it to use tabs over spaces. You can even set it to have a specific width for tabs or spaces. Level 3 strictly deals with logging. Level 4 is auto-loading. Level 0, which is not on here, was auto-loading, but it has been deprecated in favor of level 4. Does anyone use Laravel, Cake, or Symfony? Those actually use auto-loading level 4 as part of their composer file. So if you go in there and poke at it and it says PSR4 for the auto-loading, that's what it's referring to. Like the other ones up there, caching, messaging, containers, hypermedia, simple cache, and whatnot, they really just deal with here's what those things should do and some standards they should adhere to, so no matter what service someone uses for a container or no matter what service someone uses for caching, it will work the same. Your PHP can look the same, and what functions what functions outside of your PHP or kind of under the hood all works the same. An example of that would be memcache, Redis, and ZeroMQ, RabbitMQ. There's a bunch of iron.io, I think is the other one. There's a lot of different caching services. They all adhere to the same interface so that no matter which service you go to, the get everything out of your cache, that method is pretty much the same no matter where you go. So really all you have to do is change which service you're pointing to, not your code that works with it. So those are things. On the next slide, I've got the URL for PHP Code Sniffer, which is the CS one. It's made by a group called Squeeze Labs, and they pretty much, they're the working group behind PSR. A lot of these, they kind of help maintain it. They're a group of individuals, some that are liked, some that are not liked so much. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. He defected and started using Ruby. He's a British guy. Spoke at Utah Open Source 2 years ago. Can't think of his name now. Phil Sturgeon. Phil Sturgeon, that's his name. He helped start a lot of these, and I think he had a lot of great points. So if you want to go more into it, you can just do php-fig.org/PSR. Squeeze Labs has more about the annotated rule set, and that is how you can set up an XML configuration file to say, these are the rules we're going to adhere to whenever we run these checks. And the nice thing about that is you can actually say, I want to include the entire PSR2 coding standard except for this rule. So it's really easy that you can have a 3-line, or actually it's not counting the headers and other stuff, it's 3 lines and you can completely set it up and tweak it the way you like it. There's even a rule set generator that goes through, and most of them, it even has examples of what the rule set is talking about. And you can just check a box next to it and it'll actually build your configuration file for you if that's what you choose. So now as to why you would want to use them. Mark kind of touched on these. The providing consistency in your code base and the less mental effort it takes you to read your code or to read code that you didn't write, the better. Potentially reducing conflicts in your code merges or the size of your code merges. It sets an expectation among your team that you're all on the same page, you're all working towards the same goal, and the expectations are enforced by a computer, so when someone doesn't meet the expectations, you don't get to go yell at your coworker. It's, you know, you can always throw up your hands and go, hey, it's the system. You all agreed to the standard, you didn't meet it, I'm not getting mad at you, it's the computer that's telling you you're wrong. And the reason I have a star next to the first one is because you really have to determine what the standard is, what the acceptable amount of mental load you're putting on yourself and your team is. I don't know if anyone follows Jeffrey Way that much. I guess a month or 2 ago there was some big hubbubaloo where he did a podcast talking about the fact that there is a mental cost. Most of us don't realize it or care much about it, but there is a mental cost every time you read code, whether it's your own or someone else's. The little subconscious, I was about to say subroutines, the subconscious acts of reading code and interpreting it and following it mentally, that's a mental load, and you have to be aware of, well, you don't have to. If you would like, it can be pertinent to be aware of that load on a team, because what may be readable for 1 or 2 people is completely unreadable for the rest of your team. One of the scenarios that I was in, I actually took over from Jake at the job we were working at. I took over his position, and we had 3 or 4 juniors, and I could tell they kept getting lost when we would open a new merge request, because a more senior developer would open the request and it would be 500-600 lines changed. And if you added the flag to take away just the white space changes, it dropped it by 200 lines. And then there was no way to do this in the diff tool, but if you took away just the lines where a curly brace was moved from the same line as your logic statement to the next line, because we had a guy who came from a C background, so every curly brace belonged on a new line. That dropped it another 100 or so lines, and so suddenly this 600 line merge request dropped to 300 or less just by removing these little opinions out of it. And I still don't, to this day, understand why they did it, but eventually, within about a month after Jake leaving, they made me the head developer, and I saw this as a great opportunity to abuse my power, and I enforced the standards. Now, I didn't actually say, these are the standards, you're going to go with it. I actually brought everyone into our little conference room, and I put up on the whiteboard, and I said, we're going to go through these topics, and they were things like, where does the curly brace belong? Do we use tabs over spaces? And I said, I have my opinion, I'll advocate for that, but if there's more people here that disagree with my opinion, I will drop it in favor of being consistent across the team. But since I'm such a charismatic guy, everyone agreed with me. We just went with what I wanted, so it all worked out really well for me in the end. Yeah, charisma. There were no threats of violence in that room.
He got it almost all right.
Isn't that what charisma is?
Klingon charisma, yes. So, but when we did that, we started doing it, and some people were grumbling because, oh, well, how are we going to do this? I don't want to have to go through the entire project, file by file, changing all these things. And I said, that's actually the nice thing. Let's see, I'll actually go back to, yeah, it was this one. The PHP CBF, I can't remember what the CBF stands for. I think it's...
Code beautifier.
Yeah, code beautifier, that's right. It will actually do a lot of things for you, like if there's tabs instead of spaces or spaces instead of tabs, it'll fix that. If your curly brace is on its own line and it needs to be moved up, it'll do that. Or if it's at the end of your class declaration, it'll move it down. So 90% of the work, we could run a single script and it fixed most of the time. And then the other idea that I posed to them is we don't have to do this on every line of every file in the entire project. You only need to do it to the ones you touch. And the nice thing about that approach was it showed us over time, over about a month or two, I called it the code decay because everything that was still using, that wasn't standardized, meant we weren't touching it, we weren't using it, we weren't looking at it, and generally that meant the code was completely unused. Now, had we had a code coverage tool and some other things that I'll talk about in a minute, it would have been easier and faster to identify those, but it was nice to help our juniors become familiar with the entire application because they got to touch little bits of it. And I said, if you open a file and it's not to standard, only deal with the method you're dealing with. Don't deal with any of the others, just fix the method you're touching. And slowly, over time, the merge request size went down, the complexity of them went down, the conflicts that we had went down. People were actually able to branch off development, spend 2-3 weeks working on it, and when they pulled in the changes from development just before they were ready to open a merge request, 95% of the time there were no merge conflicts because everyone had the game plan, everyone knew the battle plan, and everyone followed the standard. And suddenly we didn't have merge conflicts every time you wanted to merge back into the code base. So it was really, really nice. But most importantly is the when you should use this. And there's really only one thing to say. You know what you're doing, you're an adult, and so you should determine when you should use it. If you feel like the project's too small, you're the only person on it, you're tinkering with stuff, obviously, those are times you're probably not going to even want to care about this. But if you're working in a large group, you're finding these are problems that you haven't naturally settled into a standard, then these are some times to do it. Or if you find that there are too many people that kick back against it, it's not worth the mental effort to get everyone on board with it. So just remember, trust yourself on it. And the how to do it, you can use Composer. Optionally, you can have global on this, but you just include Squeeze Labs PHP Code Sniffer, or you can grab the FAR file, or if you're one of those that still uses pair, you can do it. But once you get them, the PHP CS FAR, you just add SP. It is for show progress, and the S was don't stop on errors, keep going, and then you can add colors, so it'll give you nice yellow colors for warnings, red for errors, give you a full report on every file sniffed, and then the standard is PSR2. There's actually several different standards. Zend came out with their own, Squeeze Labs has their own, PSR2 is a separate entity from Squeeze Labs, and they have their own. PSR2 tends to be the default. That's the one I used. That's the one we used at the job I was at, and it was great. And I'll tell you guys about the other company when I'm done with the unit testing section, and why they were such a pain. And I don't mean like a pain in the butt, but the actual causing me mental anguish because of the situations that I dealt with there. So moving onward to unit testing. Has anyone used unit testing at their day job? That's actually really good to see that there's that many people. I've been to talks just a year or two ago, and a room bigger than this, and the presenter asked how many people were unit testing, and I think one person raised their hand. So it's good to see that that's coming along. Unit testing, there's actually unit acceptance and functional testing are the big three. You can even make up your own other ones. I actually add API testing, but I'll go over that in a little bit. There's different frameworks you can use for testing. PHP Unit is, I'd say, probably the biggest one. I think it's the oldest one. I'm trying to remember the guy that came up with it. It's actually a German guy. Sebastian. Sebastian, great guy. He, in fact, the website for PHP Unit is not .com or .org. It's actually .de, which ironically still defaults to English, but that's the magic of computers, I guess. Codeception is actually my particularly favorite framework. It's built on top of PHP Unit, so if you use Codeception, you actually also have access to PHP Unit. There are a number of other ones. They all kind of do their own thing. I'm trying to remember, there were two other ones that were kind of big, but the last time I checked them a few months ago, they actually hadn't been updated in over a year, so I kind of assumed they were deprecated. But unit testing using a framework provides an automated, sane way to know if changes have broke one part of your application that you didn't intend to. And like I said, I'll kind of go over a little bit more on that in a minute. So where you can get them, phpunit.de, codeception.com. Quick Start provides a nice, easy way of here's how to download it, here's how to run it, and everything. So quickly, why you can unit test. You can know with much more certainty that everything is working. You have another piece in your continuous integration chain that helps ensure integrity and also is another sanity check that isn't human fallible, or less likely to be human fallible, even though it's written by humans. The big bonus that I found, if you're trying to convince others, especially non-tech people, unit testing is code reports, especially code coverage. Because I've sat in an office with a boss and I've said, hey, we should unit test. And he said, I don't know. I don't know if it's worth our time. I don't know. And not 10 minutes before we'd been talking about a bug that cropped up in the code, and I said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could catch that? And he said, yeah, but I don't know. And I said, what if I could provide you with a PDF report that shows how many files we have, how many methods we have, and how much of it is covered by tests, and the last time the test ran, and which ones passed and failed. And as soon as I said report, he was like, great, do it. I don't care. Take 2 weeks, take the whole team, I don't care. And that's all it took, was saying, yes, we can do reports. And if you have tools like Jenkins, I don't think Travis does it. There's Circle CI and a few other continuous integration tools. You can actually have it set up where after it runs the test, it'll generate the report. It can email the report or even have a web accessible login for someone who's non-technical to even just go in and say, oh, these tests ran 10 minutes ago and here's the report of them. And I know we're at 70% code coverage, which is great because 2 weeks ago we were at 60% code coverage. So we're going up. And when I say everything, of course, that means everything that you write a test for. If you don't write a test, you can't know that it's still working. Again, when to use unit testing is use this at your own discretion. Personally, I think it's a good habit to do it on all but prototyping. If you're just If you are just trying to prototype something out, obviously, don't worry about it. Sometimes though, if you feel like your prototyping is turning more into a beta, then unit testing might be helpful. Sometimes when you're prototyping, if you need to repeatedly test different scenarios, it can also be helpful. But the how, once you get Composer, as we saw on the, once you get PHP unit, you can just run the first time PHP unit generate configuration. It'll give you a nice PHP unit XML file. You can adjust any configuration in it. Codeception, you bootstrap it once and then run. And that's it, and it runs through all your tests. And even if you generate the test with PHP unit, you can still run codeception and it will check those tests. The nice thing about the Codecept bootstrap is it will create a test directory. It will create configuration files for unit, functional, and acceptance. And the difference between those, I realize I should probably go over this. Unit is to test a single function or method in your code. Let's say you have a, trying not to think of a framework specific example. You have a class that you instantiate somewhere, and it manipulates some data for you, like a request class that sanitizes some input. You need to make sure that validation method works. So you have a unit test that instantiates your request class or your validation class, passes data into your validate method, and checks what comes out. It doesn't actually deal with a web request. It doesn't deal with any other classes other than that one alone. It's in isolation. An acceptance test is more of the browser. If I visit this page, does it have this title on it? So let's say I'm trying to find user number 6. If I browse to /users/6, do I see user ID 6 on the page, or there's actually modules you can get with Codeception. They're pretty easy. You can actually grab from the database whichever user matches ID 6, so you have all that information separate from the code that you're running or the page you're visiting, and you can say, when I visit this page, does it have first name, last name, email address, and ID 6 on the page? And it's really, really great. Or you can even test your login script where if I don't fill out, or if I put in the username instead of my email address, and I click login, I want to make sure it doesn't actually send me to another page. It actually stays on the same page and I see an error message. So those are ways to do acceptance. Functional is more of the, similar to an API class, but functional I think is more of just, I visit this endpoint and I get this data. It's not specific to any data type. I like to use those when I'm testing, I use Laravel a lot. I like to use those when I'm using a controller that is not meant to be a JSON API, and then I create an entirely new group called API to consume and test just my JSON API endpoints. And it relies on REST only. So it's kind of nice, and that way I can test that any of those that come back, they come back as a JSON data type, they come back with the proper formats, and I can test all sorts of great stuff on them. And a company I was at a few years ago, when I was first really getting into unit testing, it was really great. My boss came to me and said, hey, I know you've been looking this up. Do you want to set it up for our project? Because we didn't have any. I said, yeah, sure. And he goes, great, you've got 2 weeks to figure out what framework we're going to use and start writing some tests. And I went through PHP unit and a few of the others, settled on Codeception, wrote a few tests, showed it to my boss. He said, great, let's start writing tests for everything. We went in a month from absolutely no code coverage to, I think we were at a little over 80%, and I myself had written over 400 tests. Because the nice thing about it is you can actually have a set of tests for when things should work the way you expect them, if your users are kind and actually behave. But you can also write a bunch of tests that should fail. So if I pass in, let's say we're trying to find a rating between 1 and 10, what happens if they pass in 12? What happens if they try and pass in -1? What happens if they try and pass in A? I want each one of those to fail. I never want the response back to go, hey, great, we got your response, or we got your rating, thank you. So it ended up being for any one given method that I had, there were probably 6 or 7 tests. 2 or 3 to check what was right, and then 3 or 4 to check what went wrong. So the one company that I'm thinking of, though, this was almost 5 years ago now. I think it was a little over 4. It was a small company. We worked at a pharmacy. We were trying to build a pharmacy, some software to replace an old DOS system that they were still using. And the pharmacist, the guy that owned it, he was paying for this out of pocket. So he hired myself and 2 other developers, and I was the 3rd person to join the team. And the head developer was in his 60s, and he had been writing PHP since probably PHP 3 days. And his mentality never got past PHP 4. The idea of frameworks were nonsense to him. He hated them. He said they were too cumbersome and too tough to deal with. He didn't like them. And when it comes to a prescription, we have to refill a prescription every 30 days. Well, what happens if that day falls on a Saturday? What happens if it's on a holiday? What happens if it, we got to make sure all these different things. We had a file to deal, and that was the other thing. He did not like object-oriented. Everything was functional, and there was so much copy and paste. And there was one file that dealt with that reoccurring date. And I got tasked to fix it one day because it broke because one person touched it. And it was the kind of file that at the top of the file, there's a comment that says, it had a number and then it says, increment this number every time you have to fix this file, or you have to fix this method. And it was probably up to 60 or 70. Because it was so fragile, it was so broken. I didn't know about Carbon, the library, which was a godsend when I found it. And I remember there was one day I fixed it. I got it checked into Git, and I told the lead developer, I said, I fixed it. It passed all these tests that I did, manual tests. I said, don't touch it, because if you touch it, it's going to break. We've done this 6 times before. Stop trying to touch my file. And that was a Friday afternoon, so I go home. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, I get a phone call. Hey, so I tried to optimize that method, and now it's not working. And I checked it out from Git, and it's still not working. So I need you to fix it. And it was at that point that I knew we needed unit testing for 1, and 2, we needed to follow a standard. And as much as I tried to push for it, he hated it. And I even spent one of my lunch hours one day, I think I pulled in Laravel and I pulled in Angular, and I said, look, we're trying to do this new page, and in 45 minutes, not only do I have the API completely working, I have the front end completely working, and here's all these things, and I did it in 45 minutes. And when we've tried to write this stuff in the past, it took us a week. So using a framework and unit testing, I did a week's worth of work in 45 minutes on my lunch, and that still wasn't enough to convince them. So some people, you're never going to change their mind. Other people, they'll go right along like they should with you because you're smart for using these things. So the company that I just left, we really improved the code base. We really improved the quality of it, the resilience of it. It performed so much better after we started doing unit testing. There was even a point that we could deploy at 4:30 on a Friday, go home at 5, and know that the site wasn't going to break over the weekend. And that kind of peace of mind was priceless for all of us, especially those of us who were on call. So, yes, I truly believe unit testing and coding standards can truly improve group projects. I'd recommend looking into them. If you'd like to talk to me more about it, I'm happy to chat with you. So, yeah, that's my talk. And if anyone gets the Tron reference, that's even better. So, that's it.